Hi, this is Daniel Perrin, and the talk is about investigating practices of glocalizing the news. The roadmap takes us from the research question all the way down to a conclusion overcoming ideologies of research to solve real-life problems. By the way, most of the theoretical background can be read in this publication, and the data can be accessed with this hyperlink using this password. Research question: how to glocalize the news? How does a journalist challenged by internal multilingualism balance expectations of both enacting his local media company's audience design and following ethical norms of international news journalism? By audience design, I understand a practice of customizing semiotic products in order to raise their user loyalty by anticipating their interests and prior knowledge while differentiating as much as possible from other competitors. And by multilingualism, I understand the interplay of products, practices, and practitioners, as well as contexts, in which or by whom utterances in two or more languages or varieties are used in combination. Multilingual practices include the ability to switch between formal and informal varieties within or across languages according to contextual needs. The state of research from complementary perspectives, understanding what writers do in real-world contexts. Writing and text production are individual, organizational, and social practices of reflective practitioners in a dynamically changing world. The embodied and social writing process is an overall mental, material, and social activity of producing a linguistic communicational offer in its multisemiotic co-text and dynamic context. This is how writing is conceived of today in today's state of research. Reflective practitioners nowadays are mostly seen as practitioners who are able to apply, but also to scrutinize and to further develop their practices, since they are aware that their practices are bound to context and mainly to changing context. Practices reverberate the idea of good practices and critical situations, exemplary constellations of circumstances which could lead to failure, and good practices, they help overcome critical situations. Blending methodologies by mixing methods, investigating and improving real-life writing. So, something about the method and the methodology. Extended progression analysis of broad and deep data help us find out what people do when they process texts in natural settings and why they do it. Broad and deep means multi-method approach that fosters constructing the object of research from complementary perspectives. When we talk about multi-method approach in the context of real-life writing, all the methods need to be non-invasive for the writers involved. Progression analysis is an ethnographically based context analysis combined with activity recording, so recording of everything that happens on people's screens and in their environment, and with cue-based retrospective verbal protocols. These protocols provide researchers with information about writers' awareness of what they are doing and why. Some findings. Backstage processes can highlight problems that occur without audiences being aware of it. So what we do is we construct the backstage drivers of journalistic practices in a multi-layered, multilingual setting. We have done so since 1995 in a series of research projects taking us from one news agency to the media landscape of Switzerland, and then in our most recent projects we have focused on specific aspects of semiotic activities such as argumentation or data visualization. Now let's zoom into one case. The data was collected in the context of this project here, the Ofcom project, Ofcom meaning the Swiss Federal Office of Communication, which was the funding agency. The media setting is Tele Zürich, das Fernsehen von Zürich, meaning the TV station of the city of Zurich. This is their claim. They want to be different from, especially from national TV, by focusing on topics and by speaking the language of the urban Zurich area. In an interview, the chief editor said that they are young and urban, and they work for a young and urban audience. One of the journalists we investigated said in his interview, "I happened to become a journalist." So these young people tended to be recruited from other professions. They were eager to be on screen, to make television, and to a certain extent to become famous. Let's have a look at one specific item of this journalist called SB. The journalist writes the off text of the item, and the result looks like this. It's about presidential elections in South Korea. It's a normal short media item, about 20 seconds. This is S notation. We can see what the journalist deleted and what he inserted. So the square brackets are deletions. This is the first revision, which is a deletion. And this is the 18th revision, which is an insertion. What we can see at first sight is that in the beginning, in the first part of the news, there are almost no revisions, only typos that are immediately corrected. Whereas in the second part, there's a lot of construction going on, skipping forth and back in the emerging text. You can see it here again. So the first part is written in a smooth way, just typos are corrected, and then the second part is written by jumping back and forth in this emerging text. This is visualized by the progression graph. This is the first part, linear writing, and this is the second part. So 3 attempts to write this second part. And here's the result. The first part goes as follows. Opposition wins election in South Korea. The new Korean head of state is the 74-year-old Kim Dae-jung. He calls his election victory the first peaceful transfer of power since the founding of the state. The new president, and here the construction field begins. In a first attempt, the result is the new president called on his compatriots to commit themselves to the fight against the economic crisis. The second attempt, the new president called on his compatriots to prepare for deprivations in the fight against the economic crisis. And the third and last attempt, the new president prepared his compatriots for having to accept cutbacks in the fights against the economic crisis. So, if you compare the first attempt to the last one, this is a very active president. He called on his compatriots to commit themselves to the fight against the economic crisis, whereas the last president is quite a weak defensive one. The new president prepared his compatriots for having to accept cutbacks in the fights against the economic crisis. This is not the same message at all and not the same person at all. Now, if we look at the reasons why the journalist went through all these changes, his motivation was not to get closer to the meaning, but his motivation was to find a typical Zurich dialect expression. This is from the Retrospective verbal protocol. He says, and now it's getting difficult, this is a standard German sentence I have to translate. Later on, I don't like this word because it's not yet Zurich dialect. So the driver of all these changes, of this semantic drift, is speaking proper Zurich dialect in the ears and eyes of this journalist. An interim summary. It's a local TV station. The language policy is using local dialect as audience design to make a difference to the national TV. The meaning of the news changes significantly during the writing process. The journalist is aware of his company's language policy, but is not aware of the semantic drift caused by the incremental revision. Such situated activity offers rich points of structural problems, not only in this individual case, but throughout our studies, throughout media newsrooms. We can see that the interface between languages is not as reflected on by journalists as, for example, the interface between verbal language and images. For composing images together with verbal language, there is a lot of work, practical work, being taken into account. There are manuals, there are guidelines, there are practices, there are routines. Not so for the case of translating from language 1 to language 2, or from language 1 to a vernacular of this language 1. Conclusion. Future research, as well as professional education in the field, have to elaborate on the dynamics of complexity of language diversity in the increasingly localized news flows in order to explain how, by whom, why, and with what consequences it is practiced. This means as well that ideologies, frameworks, and practices of research on language diversity and multilingualism in the media need to be reconsidered for the potential of fostering knowledge transformation. Thank you.